Galatians chapter 2, verse 8. For he that wrought effectually in Peter to the apostleship of the circumcision, the same was mighty in me toward the Gentiles.
So he's saying that the strength that Peter is effective in ministering, that's the man who, or the power that gave him his strength in ministry, is the same power that gave me my strength in ministry, only towards the Gentiles. Continue.
Verse 9. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars.
So what it's saying is, so those brothers who seem to be somewhat in the previous scriptures, those brothers, they're putting names on them now. It was James, Cephas, and John. These are disciples of Christ. They were originally unaware of Paul's ministry to the uncircumcised. And they gave Paul a hard time until it was made clear to them that in the power that Peter ministered, so did Paul. Continue.
Perceived the grace that was given unto me. They gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship.
Okay. So now we have an understanding that Paul was committed to the uncircumcised, just as Peter was committed to the circumcised. So, with that in mind, most of the time when Paul was writing, he was writing to clear up what was going on in a particular church to a people who were unaware of the law. So we'll continue on and get more scriptures that will show and bring light to this point and bring more understanding. But understand that Paul was sent to bring the gospel of Christ specifically to a people who knew nothing of the law. They didn't know of the statutes. They didn't know of the judgments of the Most High, and they were known as uncircumcised. So there was no way Paul could go in among these people, judging them and allowing others to judge them or condemn them according to the law, when they had never ever even known the law. And this was the circumstance in most of these times when people want to draw from Paul's writings to say that he is saying that the law is done away with. Because what was going on in those areas is that people were looking to judge these Gentiles trying to come to Christ for not keeping certain laws, depending on which epistle we're talking of. Just like they tried to come after Titus for not being circumcised. He didn't have to be circumcised. And so that you have to understand the context of Paul's writings and understand what he's writing about. And so he's dealing with the people who did not know the law. So he taught the Gentiles the fruits of the Spirit according to Christ so that they could transition out of their pagan ways into the gospel of Christ. And so you must understand the spirit of the law, which is the gospel of Christ, and the law of grace, which is Christ's sacrifice, which is what Christ's sacrifice brought. His sacrifice brought this grace. And the gospel of Christ will lead you back to the law. So if you can understand the gospel of Christ and the spirit of the law, which is what Christ taught, it's going to bring you back to the law. So, in other words, Paul was going a roundabout way to bring these people that were used to a pagan style of living back to the law. He was teaching them how Christ taught. He was teaching them the spirit of the law. He was teaching them the gifts of the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit, love, kindness, meekness, long-suffering, patience. All these things lead back to the law. The spirit of the law leads back. If you keep these things, you will be keeping the law. But Paul wasn't going to allow, or wasn't going to go in there and say, you'll be judged because you're not circumcised. When he understood the spirit of the law was not talking about a physical cutting of a foreskin. It was talking about cleaning the heart The Old Testament even gives testament to that. So this is how Paul went about administering his ministry. Let's get a couple examples of how he did this. Let's go to Acts 13, verse 42.
Acts chapter 13, verse 42. And when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath.
And when the Jews were gone out of what?
The synagogue.
They were gone out of what?
The synagogue.
The synagogue. Mm-hmm. Okay, what day was this that they left out of the synagogue?
That they might be preached to the next Sabbath.
The Sabbath, okay. So they were in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and they wanted to come, these Gentiles wanted to come back to hear what Paul was saying next Sabbath. So Paul went into the synagogue on the Sabbath teaching the gospel of Christ and the history of Israel, and the Gentiles wanted to hear more the next Sabbath. If you read the context of this scripture, the scriptures previous to this, it shows Paul in the Sabbath preaching and teaching after the law had been read, which was a custom of Israel to do on the Sabbath. Then they would begin to exhort and go into explanations of the law, then go into explanations of the scripture. So Paul stood up and he gave a history of Israel, and then he started to teach and preach the gospel of Christ. And after he did this, the Gentiles wanted him to come back next Sabbath. The Jews and the Gentiles, matter of fact. Continue with verse 43.
Verse 43. Now when the congregation was broke up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of the Most High.
Okay, so what we have here is in verse 42, it says, and when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue. So some of the Jews had separated themselves and gone on for the rest of their day. After that had happened, there were Gentiles that came to Paul in verse 42. And then we read in verse 43, we see, now when the congregation was broken up, some of the Jews and religious proselytes, a proselyte is a Gentile who lives as a Jew and follows the laws and customs of Israel. And some of the religious proselytes followed Paul. So there were some of the Jews that went their own way, and then there were some of the group of the Jews who came to Paul, along with the proselytes and the Gentiles, came to Paul and Barnabas, and they said, continue with us. Meaning, can you stay? Can you tarry with us with the grace of the Most High? So as we can see here, some of Israel accepted the gospel and encouraged Paul to stay and continue teaching them. Continue with verse 44.
Verse 44. And the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city.
So now the whole city, the next Sabbath day. So for those who are saying that Sabbath is done away with, Sunday's the new day, what we're reading here is Acts. Christ has been resurrected. And here we have an apostle of Christ continuing to meet on the Sabbath. Now on this Sabbath day, the whole city was probably full of Gentiles to whom Paul was committed to minister to. When it says the whole city, within that whole city, surely there were Gentiles. And they all had come back wanting to hear from Paul. Continue reading.
Verse 44. And the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of the Most High. Verse 45. But when the Jews saw the multitude, they were filled with envy, and spake against those things which were spoken by Paul contradicting and blaspheming.
So here we have now there are Jews. It says when they saw the multitudes. So it wasn't what he was saying, because they could have been filled with, if it was what he was saying, they could have been filled with envy from the last week. Now these Jews that saw the multitude, it's either the Jews that had separated before the Gentiles and the proselytes came to Paul saying come back next week. It was either them, or it was the Jews that were saying come back next week. Whichever group these Jews came from, they were envious because of the multitude that showed up. It wasn't because of what he was saying. It says, but when the Jews saw the multitude, not because the Jews heard what he was saying, when the Jews saw the multitude, they were filled with envy. They're sitting there thinking, man, who is this Paul? He comes up out of nowhere and he can get a crowd like this. I've been preaching here or teaching here, or I've been here for such and such years. We never pulled in a multitude like this. So they envious over another man's labor and another man's work, rather than joining in with this brother and edifying his what that he had these people coming to hear about the gospel of Christ. They want to be jealous of his work. Continue.
Verse 46. Then Paul and Barnabas waxed bold and said, it was necessary that the word of the Most High should first have been spoken to you.
So he's saying to these who have come filled with envy and declaring that he's speaking contradictions and blasphemy, he declares to them, he says, look, it was necessary that the word of the Most High first should be spoken to you. Who were the oracles of the Most High first given to? Paul even says in Romans 3:2 that, what good is the circumcision? And he said much in many ways, because the oracles of the Most High was given to the circumcised. So yeah, it was necessary that the word of the Most High should first have been spoken to you, Paul is saying here. Go ahead.
I'm in the middle of verse 46. But seeing ye put it from you, and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, lo, we turn to the Gentiles.
And even to add to that, when Christ came, he said, go not but to the lost sheep of Israel. Don't go into Samaria or to the Gentiles. Go to the lost sheep of Israel. So this is also speaking of that it was necessary that the word of the Most High should first have been spoken to you, meaning the Jews. But when it was shown that you were unworthy of everlasting life, we turned to the Gentiles. Why did they turn to the Gentiles? Well, even though it was given to the Gentiles, it was given to them to eventually evoke us back to them. Not to mention that it was also always meant for the Gentiles to have a remnant in the kingdom of the Most High. So that's why it was given to the Gentiles. Continue. Let's go to verse 47.
Verse 47. For so hath the Most High commanded us, saying, I have set thee to be a light of the Gentiles.
So here it is. Us as Israel have been set to be a light to the Gentiles. The Most High has set us up as the light to the Gentiles. But how can we be a light if we don't know who we are? So this brings to the point of why it's important to know who we are when people want to say, well, what difference does it make? Yeah, okay, from what you showed me, we could be Israel. But why does it matter? What difference? As long as we love Christ. It matters because we're supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. If we don't know that we're the light bearers, how will we know to pick up the light? If we don't know that we're to carry the light to the Gentiles, we'll never pick up the light. Continue with verse 48, please.
Verse 48. And when the Gentiles heard this, they were glad and glorified the word of the Almighty. And as many as were ordained to eternal life believed.
So once they heard Paul say what he had to say, because you deemed yourself unworthy, we came to the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
The Gentiles were elated. It was like, hey, they were like, hey, I'll take it. You know, they started worshiping because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, see, this whole incident that we just went over, it occurred on an island called Cyprus, not too far from Jerusalem. And the Jews that lived there were upset with Paul for what he was saying. And because of what he was saying, they called him blasphemous and contradictory. Mm-hmm. Why were they so against what Paul was teaching? Let's go into Acts 14. And let's get some more understanding on that. Acts 14, verse 24.
Acts chapter 14, verse 24. And after they had passed throughout Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia.
So this is them. This is after they left Cyprus, which is where the previous ordeal went down. They started traveling through these lands that were just mentioned. Continue.
Verse 25. And when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. Verse 26. And thence sailed to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of the Most High for the work which they fulfilled.
So now they left Cyprus, went through these other countries that they named, and settled in Antioch. So they end up staying in Antioch for a long time, teaching and preaching. Mm-hmm. So let's jump from chapter 14. Let's jump to chapter 15 and start at verse 1.
Acts chapter 15, verse 1. And certain men which came down from Judea.
So here it is. After Paul and Barnabas had put in work in Antioch, men from Judea, they come down. Mm-hmm. Let's see what they're saying. Go ahead and read about the men from Judea.
And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved. So
now these brothers are coming down to speak into Antioch from Judea, Judea being in Jerusalem, saying that unless you be circumcised, you cannot be saved. So here it is, Paul dealing with this circumcision thing. Mm-hmm. Same thing that he dealt with Titus, where he just came from. Mm-hmm. So we must remember who Paul ministered to. It was the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. So they, for the most part, were uncircumcised. Mm-hmm. If you remember back in Galatians 2 and 6, where we had just came from, where it was speaking of Titus, and it had the brothers who were of somewhat against Titus because he was uncircumcised. Here in Acts 15, it's narrating that full story. And see, in Galatians, it was Paul writing about what we're reading here in Acts. It was him writing an epistle to the Galatians, telling them about what happened right now, what we're reading in Acts. Mm-hmm. So this is the actual incident that came up between Paul and those disciples that seemed to be somewhat, but added nothing to him, if you remember here earlier when we were speaking on these things. Mm-hmm. So let's continue and figure out exactly what it was that upset these brothers in Acts, these Jews that made him call them blasphemous and contradictory. Mm-hmm. It basically comes down to the circumcision. Continue.
Verse 2. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them.
So here it is that Paul, from after they come to him about this, talking about coming from Judea, talking about being circumcised and in order to be saved. Well, Paul and Barnabas, they had no small dissension or disputation. That means that they had a big dissension and a big disputation, meaning that they had a problem with these brothers from Judea coming down and claiming these things. You know, Paul and Barnabas had been in Antioch laying down good solid groundwork of the gospel of Christ, and here these brothers are from Judea coming in here mixing things up. After he has brought these brothers up in the gospel, now we have somebody that want to come in and say, nah, that's not right. You need to do this. So they had no small disputation, but they had a big disputation. Continue reading.
They determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question.
So because there was such an issue between these two, between those from Judea and between Paul and Barnabas against those from Judea, speaking of the circumcision, that they was like, okay, look, how about you go to Jerusalem and gain understanding and some clarity on these things. See, it's not that I don't believe that these brothers from Judea had came to Paul and Barnabas looking to intentionally stir up issues and have problems. I believe those brothers were doing what they thought was right, but they were mistaken. To try to ask these brothers to be circumcised because they were living according to the letter of the law. Christ taught the spirit of the law. Understand that circumcision wasn't done away with, but the circumcision that is required is of your heart. What good is the circumcision if you don't live according to the law? It's no good. So Paul did not want to implement a painful tradition upon these people. He understood that the physical circumcision wasn't what made you clean, but the spiritual circumcision of the heart. Let's go to Romans. Hold where we are now. Pick up Romans 2:29. Hold Acts and pick up Romans.
Romans chapter 2, verse 29. But he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart.
Circumcision is that of the heart. He is a Jew who is one inwardly. Circumcision is of the heart. Continue.
In the spirit and not in the letter. Whose praise is not of man, but of the Most High.
It's exactly what I was just saying. Paul understood this, even though these gentlemen from Judea didn't, because they were Jews coming out of Judea. All they knew throughout life was keeping the law to the letter of it. Christ coming preaching the spirit of the law, it was new. Even it was new to them, even though previous to the law was written down, our forefathers lived according to the spirit of the law. When you go back to Enoch, Noah, all of our forefathers previous to Moses, they lived according to the spirit of the law. That's why it wasn't written down. It didn't have to be written down. It was written on their hearts. But by the time it had gotten to Moses and the nation of Israel was being formed, the Most High wrote it in the letter so that it would change their hearts. And we see that in the Old Testament. So let's go ahead and jump into the Old Testament. Jeremiah 4:4. Let's go to Jeremiah 4:4 and see what they say concerning the circumcision. See what Jeremiah says concerning the circumcision.
Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 4. Circumcise yourselves to the Most High, and take away the foreskin of your heart.
Foreskin of your
heart.
The foreskin of your
heart.
Continue.
Ye men of Judah, and inhabitants of Jerusalem, lest my fury come forth like fire and burn that none can quench it, because of the evil of your doings. So
he's not upset with them because they weren't physically circumcised. He wasn't upset and about to threaten them with fury like fire because they weren't physically circumcised. They were physically circumcised. He's making the point to them to say, circumcise your heart Just as Paul is saying.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Paul is disputing with these brothers from Judea that didn't understand this because they were so caught up in what they had been taught, the tradition of removing your foreskin.
Mm-hmm.
You can't ask a grown man that comes into the understanding that has been grown, living with his foreskin at a ripe age, and ask him to cut at a sensitive member like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because as you can see, the physical circumcision is not what brings you closer to the Most High at all. Because all of our forefathers had the physical foreskin cut off, but they still strayed away from the laws and the commandments.
Mm-hmm.
Had their heart been circumcised, they would not have strayed. This is what Christ taught, the spirit of the law, and this is what Christ taught to Paul to teach to the Gentiles. That's why he wasn't forcing them to cut their foreskin. That's why all these issues weren't going on.